Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this Northshire virtual event. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Person, Events Manager for Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York, here with my good friend and colleague, Davith Wood, Events Manager for Northshire Bookstore in Manchester Center, Vermont. Before we get started, a couple of quick notes. First of all, thank you so much for your incredible loyalty and support of independent bookstores and independent bookselling. We couldn't do events like this without the incredible loyalty and support of our customers, and all of us at Northshire are incredibly grateful to you for that. And then second of all, a logistical note, if you have any questions at all tonight, you can put them into the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. You can put questions in there at any time. We'll have time at the end of the event for some audience questions, so make liberal use of that Q&A box. And that is all the notes I have. I'm going to turn things over to Davith to introduce our guest authors tonight.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It is my pleasure to welcome Yael Schonbrun to Northshire Bookstore for her new book, Work, Parent, Thrive, 12 Science-Backed Strategies to Ditch Guilt, Manage Overwhelm, and Grow Connection When Everything Feels Like Too Much. Yael is Assistant Professor of Psychology at Brown, a family therapist, and co-host of the podcast Psychologists Off the Clock. In 2014, she wrote a piece on motherhood and ambition for the New York Times that went viral. She has since contributed a chapter to Double Bind, Women on Ambition, alongside Roxane Gay, Molly Ringwald, and others. And she's also written for Psychology Today. Lori Gottlieb, the New York Times bestselling author of the Northshire staff favorite, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, said that Work, Parent, Thrive is an invaluable roadmap for thriving in working parenthood. While Melinda Winter Moyer, author of How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes, says that Work, Parent, Thrive is an essential antidote to today's stressful working parent culture. Yael Schonbrun shares simple and useful strategies for parents who want to feel grounded, connected, and fulfilled in all aspects of their lives. We're lucky to be joined today by Alex Soojung-Kim Pang, who has spent 2 decades studying people, technology, and the worlds they make. A Silicon Valley-based futurist and consultant, he has worked with governments and Fortune 500 companies, spoken at venues ranging from the CIA headquarters to Shakespeare's Globe Theater to the Googleplex, and held academic positions at Stanford and Oxford universities. He holds a PhD in history and sociology of science, and is the author of 4 books, including The Distraction Addiction, Rest, and Shorter. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire, Alex Soojung-Kim Pang and Yael Schonbrun. Thanks. Take it away, guys.
Well, first of all, thank
hi.
you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. Alex is busy reading. I love that.
Didn't notice you there. So no, this is it's a great pleasure, and it is terrific to to be involved in an event like this, particularly to see bookstores figuring out how to make use of this great technology to keep themselves or to find new ways of connecting with audiences and to bring them together with writers. So I would personally far prefer to be up there. Obviously I'm dressed for it, but instead I'm out here in California. Anyway, when I was rereading this this book, there was something that came to mind when I was when my first kid, my daughter, was about 3 or 4 months old. And this was the phase where she would, wake up a couple times in the middle of the night and would need some help getting back to sleep. And my go-to thing by that point that I'd realized was to turn on, you remember iTunes had this kind of spacey visualizer thing that if you played music would do these cool kind of trippy patterns. I would put on Miles Davis's Kind of Blue and the visualizer, and she would watch that and eventually get back to sleep. And at some point I realized, it occurred to me, this was like dealing with a baby was like a hard patch of graduate school, like in terms of just the sheer amount of work and sleep deprivation and having to deal with this like irrational being who you were trying to figure out. And you never know sort of where education is going to be sort of useful, but but I found that thinking about it that way was actually pretty useful for me, in that I had survived this one thing, I had learned from it, and so maybe I could apply it to, or in this other area. And I was reminded of this while I was rereading Work, Parent, Thrive, because I think that it was an example of the kind of connection that I think the book does a great job of advocating for, and suggesting that there actually are ways of sort of thinking about how we sort of do the work of being parents that can sort of draw on parts of our lives that we often think of as being sort of competitors with, or in conflict with, parenting. And that, if we're able to make this jump, can make us better parents, can probably make kids better people, and certainly can help us at the very least, sort of survive this experience. And so, and anyway, so, sort of thanks for giving me a chance to sort of remember that part of my life, but also sort of to make to be able to connect it with other work and challenges that that I think all of us are dealing with. And so, I wanted, and I thought maybe a way to start this to start this conversation was to, first off, sort of invite you to sort of explain the big idea of the book, and that, and then second, sort of, was there a kind of either a parenting experience or a parenting moment that that came to mind as emblematic of sort of what you're talking about in here?
Yeah. Well, let me just back up and say, Alex, your book, Rest, was really a transformative read for me. And you were talking about very different, just buttering you up. No, but your book, Rest, has this line where you say that rest and work are not adversaries, they're allies. And I think about work and parenting much in the same way, where we think it's a great book, highly recommend it, very readable, very fun and funny. Alex is a very funny writer, but you'll learn so much. But it's this idea that we often think about things in conflict with one another, and just as much as they're in conflict, they also exist in harmony, right? They complement one another. And if we can transform our mindset to seeing things as beneficially pressing upon each other, then it really transforms our experience of the tension between things. So, the tension between work and rest, in Alex's case, in what he writes about, and in what I write about, it's the tension between roles. And so, I'm not suggesting that there isn't tension between roles. My God, there is. And your example of your infant daughter is a really good one. Those years are exhausting and stressful, and that is true. That is real. And at the same time, there are opportunities for enrichment, for growth, for compassion building, for resilience, for creative problem solving that occur because it's so hard, because our roles press upon each other. And when we get so trapped in the thinking of, these things are pressing against each other and it shouldn't be this way, and this is a problem that needs to be solved, we miss out on these opportunities for enrichment. not to mention the fact that there's really no way around it. If you inhabit multiple roles, they will be at times in conflict with each other. I talk about work and parenting, but this is true, if you're a friend and a partner, or if you're a child and a worker, right? Like, our roles sometimes want things from us at the same time. And so we need to sort of figure out like how to navigate that tension. And again, if we can sort of develop the mindset of, okay, this is hard and there are opportunities here, then it helps us to navigate the unavoidable challenges a little bit more strategically. And what's so amazing, and Alex goes into this in his book, Rest, right? That there's like science that backs up the benefits with the tension between work and rest. And in my case, when I'm talking about role tension, there's science that backs up the benefits of there being a really helpful, beneficial role between our multiple demanding roles. So in response to your question about, was there a pivotal moment? I think when I became a parent, I really thought that I would have the whole working parent thing in the bag. Like, I really loved my job. I'd worked really, really hard. I had a very supportive work environment, very understanding mentors, colleagues who were parenting in ways that I deeply admired, a supportive partner. So I come from a place of enormous privilege. So it was quite a shock to my system when I found myself crying every day on my commute to work. And it was very, very sad. And I really, really struggled. What do I do with myself? Because I am an ambitious professional, and yet I was so unhappy when I was at work. And when I was home with my kid, I was just feeling like, oh, all my colleagues are lapping me, and this isn't who I want to be and how I want to be. And I really didn't know what to do. And so I started reading everything that I could get my hands on from the bookstore. And most of what I found was really pointing to like the systemic problems, and they are real, they are legitimate. Like the fact that America is the only developed country that has no paid family leave is really, tragic and pretty shameful. And, workplaces, I think, have grown more flexible, but, at the time that I became a parent so long ago, because I'm so old, weren't quite as flexible as they are now. And there still needs to be enormous progress. And Alex talks about this in his book, Shorter, which is terrific also. So those systemic outside of the body issues are real, but I'm a clinical psychologist by training. And so I felt like, it wasn't speaking to the piece that I was really experiencing, of like the identity crisis and sort of who am I going to be now that I'm a parent and I want to engage in parenting, but I'm still an ambitious person. And so I started reading in the academic literature, and what I found there actually really was quite helpful. There was this concept of work-family enrichment that I talk extensively about in this book. And all of these different ideas about how we navigate the tension between roles in very beneficial ways. And so that's the book that I ended up writing. But, I early on in this process, I wrote a piece for the New York Times, and I had this like one pivotal moment, and it happened a lot, but where I was like working on an academic paper during my kid's nap, and I'd be like finally in the flow. And then a kid would wake up and say, I'm awake. And so it's those moments where you're just like, these things are crashing into each other, when you have a big meeting and your kid is sick, or when you have something really exciting professionally happening, but like there's something really important that your kid wants you to attend at their school. Like there's these moments, and some of them are not terribly important, and some of them matter deeply, right, to your sense of self and to how you want to show up in the world. Those are real. So, talking about this issue from a psychological perspective is something that felt really important to me, and also transforming the conversation to one that wasn't exclusively negative, but also thinking about the tension between roles from a more positive psychology point of view.
Mm-hmm. I think that, one of the things that I appreciate about the book was that actually the acknowledgement that parenting actually is, under the best of circumstances, really challenging. And part of that is just the kid's fault, because
totally, they're monsters.
I'm going to go there. Children are vampires, right? They will
suck the lifeblood out of you.
Exactly. They will consume every bit of time, resource, energy, money, etc., that they can, and it's not their fault, right? This is just this is what they are. This is just what they naturally do at a young age, and so it's not like you can sort of really like train them out of it until they decide until they get older and are on their own. But I think that the sort of acknowledging that it's, that it is actually really challenging, that there are certain things about being a parent that you just can't get around, and indeed you kind of shouldn't try. I think I just find that a welcome corrective to like the Instagram filtered view of parenting that makes it look a lot more effortless than anybody who I know has experienced. But there are a couple times you talked about changing mindset, and I want to back up a second and just for people who aren't familiar with it, explain what a mindset is, because this isn't just, it's not just a vague term. There's there's actually something a little technical behind it. So Yael, what's a mindset?
So mindsets are a set of overarching beliefs in a particular area. So this research started with the pioneering work of psychologist Carol Dweck. So a lot of parents are familiar with the growth mindset and fixed mindset as it relates to student learning. So in that case, it's like the mindset about your capacity to learn math, let's say. So if you have a fixed mindset, you are more likely to believe that your capacities are inborn and are not going to change. So I am good at math or I'm not good at math. Like this is a talent that I have or that I don't. In contrast, a growth mindset is a belief that where you start is not necessarily where you end, and that with passion, interest, and practice that you can get to a different place. Like you may never be as naturally talented as somebody who was just born loving numbers, but you can learn and grow and become much better if you are willing to, do what it takes to do that. And so what is so cool about mindset research in general is that so many of the things in life that we think of as fixed, inborn, like unchanging, it turns out that a lot of them are changeable. So we think about like, oh, there are happy people and there are unhappy people. Nope. We can grow our happiness. There are aggressive people and not aggressive people. Nope. We can learn how to be less aggressive. There are things like, people who don't get along. Nope. People can grow to get along. I mean, one interesting one because I do a lot of couples therapy is like, we have sexual chemistry or we don't. Nope. You can learn to have sexual chemistry. So the more that we have a growth mindset, the more that we can develop capacities that we didn't have at the beginning. And, for a lot of us, that really is important. In some areas, maybe it doesn't matter, but like if it is important to you, for example, to parent well, and you didn't start off parenting well, no problem. That's a skill that can be learned. So I, in general, am in favor of growth mindsets because it just gives you an opportunity to get to a different place than where you started. And that can be quite helpful if you don't like where you started. And most of us don't, right? Most areas of life, we start not knowing how to do a thing that seems cool to know how to do. So if you have a growth mindset, then you're willing to make mistakes, to fall on your face, to try hard, to access good teachers, to try different strategies. And that can get you to a different place. So when it comes to work and family and the relationship between the two, what I think about as a fixed mindset in that arena is a conflict mindset. And that's this idea that like there's a fixed pie of resources. And so when you're working, it's taking away from your parenting. And when you're taking, it's taking away from your working. So that's fixed and limited, and you can't get anywhere because these two roles exist in contrast. The only thing that could fix it would be if you had more structural support from the outside. And what I suggest, and the science really backs this up, is that the two roles actually complement each other and feed each other. Not exclusively, like there's a lot of nuance to this. Like there are only 24 hours in a day and you should probably sleep for some of them. You only have so much energy before you need to take a nap. But in many ways, the roles can really feed each other. And I think about this like through three distinct paths. So one is the skill transfer effect. So when you're parenting, you're often working on developing patience and perspective taking. And lo and behold, that really helps in the workspace. When you're working, you're developing certain skills. So Alex and I write and we think deeply, but other people might serve customers or have like a skill like building something. That can actually teach your kids a lot and in really specialized ways, not to mention that actually juggling lots of roles is a way that you model and teach them. The second pathway is the stress buffer effect. And that's the idea that our stressful experiences in one role can be complemented because we have another role to step into. So if you're having a tough time at work, your boss is micromanaging you, being critical of you, you can go home and have a connective, positive experience with your kid. If your kid is having a really difficult developmental period, like I remember, for example, when my youngest was an infant and he was not sleeping well, I just could not stop obsessing about his sleep. And I was exhausted, but going to work felt like a reprieve. I could have an opportunity to think about something other than the fact that he was torturing all of us. And yes, I was tired, but it felt like a break from that stressor. And then the final pathway is what I call the additive pathway. So psychologists define happiness in a variety of ways, but one of the ways is a sense of meaning and purpose, right? We feel happier in life when we are doing things that seem meaningful and that they matter to the world and to us. Well, the more roles we have, the more we are able to access that. So when your kids grow up and leave the house, that doesn't mean that you don't have meaning and purpose if you have a job where you can find meaning and purpose. And if you're having a tough time at work and feeling like your work doesn't really matter, you can dive into family life and find meaning, a sense of meaning and contribution there. So through those three pathways, it sort of changes this idea that work and parenting only compete against each other and that we can't get anywhere different. In other words, it helps us move from a fixed mindset of working parenthood to a growth mindset in working parenthood. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense to me. I mean, are there
Ask any questions in the chat if you have them.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, I mean, I know the things that that interest me in this project, but absolutely, if folks have other things that they're sort of that they want to ask, or questions that you want to kind of line up before the Q&A, then please sort of put them in the chat whenever you feel like. I mean, it feels the transfer thing reminds me of something I have been hearing talking to companies that move to shorter work weeks, which is, and I talk to a lot of these companies now, that one of the really interesting things with 4-day week companies is they begin to exhibit a preference for hiring working mothers, partly which is in contrast to lots and lots of even sort of avowedly progressive places. And the way that they explain this is that in a 4-day week company, you need people who are able to really focus, focus for particular periods of time, be heads down, get stuff done, who can be kind of ruthless with their ruthless time managers, but also balance that with a degree of empathy and an ability to collaborate and have a whole set of sort of soft skills. And the people who have both of those are working parents and especially working moms, and that the experience of being a parent sort of gives them capacities that they are able to transfer back into the workplace that turn out to be sort of super valuable when your time and everybody else's time is seen as a real as the precious commodity that it truly is. So, but I think, I think I see real world examples of sort of that transfer moving not just from work to parenting, but sort of from parenting to work as well. I'm curious, are there any times when fixed mindsets are a good thing? Because it feels to me like, in Dweck's work, and whenever people talk about sort of mindset, it always feels like fixed mindset bad, growth mindset good. And I mean, or is there a line of argument that goes, under certain circumstances, there is value to a fixed mindset?
Probably. I mean, I was, if you come from a family where everybody is 5 feet and shorter, thinking that you're going to make it to the NBA is probably a fixed mindset that serves you better in terms of where to direct your energy. It is useful. I mean, not everyone can be great at everything, right? There's certain things that I'm just probably not ever going to be good at, that they're not my natural skill set. There are so many people that are competing for that it probably doesn't make sense for me to put in a whole lot of energy to becoming a master. But if it's something that matters to me to get a little bit better at, then I do think, in general, a growth mindset is great. It sort of depends on what outcome you're shooting for. But I do, it is important to recognize that just because you have a growth mindset, like you can't just do anything, if you put in enough energy, like life doesn't work that way. We all come in with a certain set of, endowed characteristics, and they can transform based on our effort. But there are, limits to everything, that is also true.
Mm-hmm. I was also curious, can you say a little bit more about the research on the benefits of of managing or of conflicting roles? That, I mean, there's, are there particular, what's this research look like? Like, is it like, does it come from like Framingham heart level or of longitudinal studies, or is it like, you take a bunch of people and they're solving math problems while they're also trying to do something else? What's that research, what's that science look like?
Well, so I mean, depends specifically on what you're talking about. Like, for
Sure.
example, there is, there's interesting studies that are qualitative studies that ask people, what their experience is like in managing lots of different roles. I cite one, for example, that was conducted with social workers over a year time, where they were interviewed, and social workers it was just the one role, but social workers are sort of in this interesting position where they're managing cases, and they're also connecting with services in the community and with policemen and with jails. And so they're managing a lot of different relationships and a lot of competing needs. And what, in the beginning of the year, when the social workers were interviewed, they talked about like the impossible challenges set before them. And by the end, what the researchers found is that many of the social workers had like developed really interesting creative problem solving, had changed the goalpost, had sort of found really clever ways to navigate what seemed at first to be impossible. So that's like one kind of qualitative study. There's a lot of self-report studies in the literature on work-family enrichment and work-family conflict, where people ask about, what is it? They're sort of like looking at the directionality. So work impact on family, family impact on work, and looking at sort of the nature of that association and how people experience in this sort of self-report way. There's some interesting creativity studies, and you talk about some of them in your writing as well, that look at, when people are under pressure and when they are sort of moving from one kind of thinking to another, which I sort of take to be like moving from one role to another. That's sort of analogous. That just look at creative tasks and seeing how people perform. So there's a lot of different ways that, I mean, I reference studies that are conducted in a lot of different ways. So some longitudinal research, some qualitative research, some sort of self-report research, some laboratory research. But there's, it's an interesting field, and I think has much progress that could be made in terms of how people conduct the research. And I think in particular, looking at work family enrichment over time, I think is interesting. So looking at people from when they first become parents and seeing how their skills in the various roles develop, enrich each other, and also take away from each other. Because again, I think it's a both and, right? There are ways that they compete in a finite, limited pie way, and there are also ways that they serve each other and feed each other. And so looking at that complicated association and transformation over time is really fascinating.
For the record, I am engaged in the multiple role of both listening to you, but also sort of petting my dog, who came in and lay down and insisted that it was time for tummy rubs. So once again, having to navigate these multiple roles.
It looks very complicated.
Well, mainly it's ergonomically not great, but it also it does serve to sort of keep them a little quieter. So that's a benefit for the for our listeners. I was also curious, so reading this as a parent, thinking in terms of sort of being able to move from a kind of conflict mindset to move away from that toward sort of
an enrichment mindset.
To an enrichment mindset. Clearly this, as a strategy for sort of like for first of all surviving parenthood, and then second probably for feeling like you do a better job as a parent. And see, that's a cool thing, right? Being able to sort of, as you put it, unhook from unhelpful labels. There's benefit there. Is there now, or how confident can we say that this actually makes for like better kids? If we do all this stuff, sort of do kids report being happier, healthier, or are they more likely, sort of to, get early admission into whatever Ivy League sort of institution, what
I'm
really
glad
matters?
that you're naming the most important outcomes. No,
exactly. I mean, sort of. But I mean, sort of is what research is there or evidence is there that this actually is sort of like a better, this yields better kid outcomes as well as better parent outcomes?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And there's a couple of studies. There's not enough studies, I would say. But one study that I love is a 3-year-long study that looked at parents, at mothers' employment status and children's well-being over the first 3 years of life. And what they found was, and so mother's employment status was working or not working, full-time parenting, not working outside of the home. And the well-being was assessed on a variety of different levels. And the sort of basic research findings suggest that regardless of what your status is, if the mother is happy, if she feels good about being a stay-at-home parent or outside of the home working parent, that is good for her well-being, and children do better. And this makes perfect sense because what we know from positive psychology research from the study of happiness is that when parents are more content, their children do better. And that makes sense, right? Because there's kind of this contagion effect of anxiety and depression and all sorts of mental health problems. It's hard for kids to get what they need if a parent is struggling with deep unhappiness. And so if you're more content with whatever it is that you're doing, that's good for your kids. So that's one point. Another point that I talk a lot about in the book is, so what is good parenting, right? That's a complicated question to ask, and it really depends on the kid. But some of the messages that are so prominent in our environment these days is that like good parents are always worried, are always paying attention, are always enriching their kids, are always, responding when their kid is really unhappy and, helping their kid not to feel embarrassed or fail. And that's actually not accurate. That is not good parenting. It is good for us to give our kids some space, to allow them to make mistakes, to not swoop in and save them every time. Right? You have to do this in a developmentally appropriate way. We do have to keep our kids safe. That is good parenting, keeping our kids safe. But roundly, my suggestion to many of the parents that I meet with in my therapy office is like, do less. Let your kids figure things out a little bit more. It's going to be uncomfortable for them, and it's going to be uncomfortable for you, because one of the things that we're wired to do as parents is be responsive, especially early on. But that is like a wiring that comes from pre-modern times, where when you didn't pay attention to your child, they were at high risk for being eaten by a predator. That is no longer the case, but because our culture has progressed and evolved much more rapidly than our brain wiring, we still have these hangover effects of like, oh my God, my kid is unhappy and I need to do something desperately quickly. This is a problem. There's, imminent danger. And that is a wiring that we can't avoid, right? It's just kind of programmed into us, just like our kids are programmed to set it off, right? And get our attention and whine and like call our attention to their needs. But we can choose, using our beautiful prefrontal cortex that has developed over the past few millennia, we can decide to override that, kind of like the manual override of like, okay, it makes sense that my kid is upset. It makes sense that I'm getting triggered to want to help them. And also it could be a good opportunity for me to step back. And what I'll add is that working parenthood actually provides a really nice opportunity, because you have to involve other caregivers because you're at work, and you can't be around all the time because you're working. And that causes a lot of working parents, including myself, to feel guilty. Again, that is wired into us. It is okay to feel guilty, but we can make informed decisions about what we do with that guilt. We can notice that guilt, like when I can't chaperone my kids' field trip because I have a full caseload, as happened this fall when they went on their apple picking trip. I feel kind of bad. He's a kindergartner. I'm never going to have that opportunity. And then I can say, you know what? That guilt is a cue for me to take care of relationships. I care so much about him, but he's fine. He's going to be fine. And he might miss me, and he might feel sad, and I might feel sad. But actually, there's also a really great opportunity for him to be more independent. He told me that the chaperone helped him get the apple that was super high up the tree, and he was so proud of himself for asking the other chaperone that he didn't know how to do that. So he had an opportunity to connect with another caregiver, to ask for help, which is so great, because I would have just swooped in and done it. And so there's these opportunities that are embedded in working parenthood because of that tension between roles that we can take advantage of, that can help us manage what's wired in that may not be so helpful in our modern parenting culture. You know what I mean?
So I'm hearing that the impact on elite college admissions is, the literature on that really isn't very clear, but there are lots of other benefits.
Let me say one other thing, which is that when we leave our kids to be more independent, they end up building more self-competency, right? More creative problem solving, more ability to trust their own intuition about how to handle things. And that actually is really good for colleges. I mean, if you read, Julie Lythcott-Hames has this great book. I'm going to forget the name of it. It's How to Raise an Adult, or I'm
that
forgetting.
Sounds right.
But she sat on the admissions committee at Stanford University, Stanford University, the best of the best. And what she writes about is how appalled she was, how many students just looked like their parents had kind of driven the bus the entire childhood, and that they didn't, once they got to college, even if their transcripts were really, really impressive, know how to take care of themselves. And it was really concerning. And so she started really actively looking for other attributes. And so we want our kids, sure, we want them to do well. We want them to get into good schools. But at the end of the day, what we want them to do is be self-sufficient, be competent, trust themselves, feel solid in their skin. And if we overparent, we interfere with that development. And what they're getting into college.
Right. So, I used to joke that if my kids did not become child soldiers, or if were not felled by some easily communicable disease and didn't turn into serial killers, then I was in the top 20% of parents. And that which was,
I like that you set the bar low. That's awesome.
Look, you got to clear it somehow, right? But part of the serious, in a way, the serious thing here is, first of all, that there is, I think, wisdom in doing less, kind of strategically, that there that kids can learn an awful lot of stuff without us, or when they're bored, or
Yes.
when they're on their own. There's actually some lovely stuff by Mary Helen Immordino Yang at USC about about boredom in kids, and how basically this encourages them. I don't know why Siri thinks that she's part of the conversation, but the more the merrier. But that boredom and downtime turn out to be correlated with higher levels of resilience, imagination, sociability, all kinds of things that we know are really good for kids. And that there really is a wisdom in being thoughtful about doing less for your kids. That in the long run, that is something that is actually good for them. And you talk in the book about sort of doing less, about you have this chapter called remember to subtract, which is not just about, like a sort of, Instagram worthy minimalism, but is but makes the argument that there's that doing less, actually there are cognitive benefits to subtracting things from sort of our lives or our schedules. And can you elaborate a little bit on this? Because it feels like the doing less stuff that's a message worth sharing.
Yeah. I think it's a really important message, especially for anything in this self-help genre, because we're always being told, like, do more things. And if, any of you out there listening are working parents, like, it can be a little frustrating because you already have too many things that need doing. And so I love any advice and research that suggests that less is a good thing to be doing. So I'll start by saying, like, one thing that's really interesting from this research is that I talk a lot about evolution, but like, we're not wired to think about subtracting when we encounter a problem. So when we're stressed out, our default tendency is like, what more can we do? So it makes sense that the self-help literature is so focused on that. Because think about like the rushed, I like made a joke that in the book that, when I'm rushing through Target is like the worst, like that's when I, spend my entire income on like the cartload of crap that I don't need, because I'm stressed out and I'm not thinking through. And, the easiest thing to do is just add more stuff. So we often see less as an outcome, as like a desirable outcome. That's why Marie Kondo has been so successful, because less seems like a good thing. And we might even see that with our kids, like when they're struggling, like if you think about doing less and having less stuff on your kids' calendar, it might seem like a good idea, but it's like the getting there that's really tricky. And again, that's because we're not wired to think about subtracting as an option. So like we might like the outcome, but like the action to get there isn't something that comes very naturally to most of us. And so thinking about it more deliberately and developing practices to remember to subtract is really good. But in answer to the first part of your question, which is, what's the data on less being a good thing? I mean, I talked a little bit about less parenting, and again, the data is pretty strong. Like letting your kid, leaving, as you mentioned, like leaving your kids to be bored is actually quite good for them. It's where creativity lies. It's also how people get to know themselves. Like if we're constantly, absorbing entertainment, we don't have a lot of time to like sit with ourselves and know ourselves. And like, that is a really important thing for a small person to be knowing, like, who am I? How do I want to be? What creative thoughts do I have? What am I interested in? And if we're constantly being entertained, we don't have an opportunity to get to know ourselves. It sort of like distracts us from that process. When it comes to work too, this may be surprising, but like less is more there too. When like there's this one study that I loved where they found that too much nodding actually decreases how much respect you'll get. So like doing a little bit less, trying to garner favor can actually increase the respect that others have for you. So don't do too much. And the more that you can say no to things that either aren't in your wheelhouse or that don't matter as much to you, the more you're able to say a wholehearted yes to the things that do. So it's a little bit like pruning a plant. Like keep the beautiful parts that are, really going to make your living room shine and going to keep the plant healthy, and prune away the debris that's just kind of mucking it up. And when we do that with deliberate intention and when we develop habits around it, then we have like a more well-crafted work life and parenting life and schedule, like a more sane schedule. So for me, and I think for most people, like a little bit of downtime during the week is really, really important. Like for my sanity, for my kids' sanity, for my sustainability. I mean, this gets back to rest, but it's so tempting to always fill that time. Like I work so hard to clear out a spot, and then another class comes up or another work opportunity comes up. And so it really does require you to be deliberate. It is not easy to do less, but it's so helpful. And when you get to that point of having a week where there is less going on, do an experiment, like see for yourself, like, are you able to be more present at work and more present with your kids because you're not flying around constantly, feeling behind the 8 ball in all the tasks that need to be done, and, trying to like answer emails as you're on your way to picking up your kids. And by the way, I'm guilty of all of this. So this is something that for most humans doesn't come naturally, but is such a helpful practice to really think about doing less in both parenting and in work. And be deliberate. Like, I think the most helpful thing is like figure out the things that are value aligned and the activities that you spend a lot of time on that aren't consistent with the kind of life that you want to live. And those things, try to remove them. For many people, it's like time on social media or time with people who are depleting and not enriching for your family life or your work life. So figure out the things that occupy a lot of time and require a lot of energy that don't feel like they contribute to a really meaningful, fulfilling life, and delete those things as much as you can.
One of the other things that keeps coming up here is an ability to the value of being able to reflect on your own kind of mental state, or to observe your emotions rather than just living in them. And both as a parent trying to figure out strategies that work better for you, but also as as a bored child trying to find stuff to do or learn about themselves, this is something that we don't think of necessarily as really a skill, but which turns out to be immensely valuable. And I was trying to think, like, how old or how young a kid, at what age can you begin to, do kids begin to have that kind of capacity for reflection on like their own mental states or emotional states?
That's a great question.
Like, can a 3-year-old do that, or is it like when you're 8? Or I know some people who are 20 who still struggle with that.
Totally. Yeah. Well, so it is a skill. So growth mindset with this one. And right. So we have to be able to perspective take a little bit to be able to look at our own self. So and that kind of ability happens around 3. It starts to emerge a little bit. But I will say, interestingly, right. And it's not going to be very refined at that age, but you can start to see people understanding that other people see things differently, like from, object permanence to feelings. But this is something I talk about regularly with my 6-year-old that I've been talking about with him for a number of years. It's a little bit unfair question because I'm a psychologist, so I'm constantly teaching my kids these things, but they really take to it and really get it. Like, my kids are really skillful because I am constantly prompting them to be thoughtful about it, at being able to articulate and like recognize that they're feeling a way. And this is something that, varies by temperament. My middle child has bigger feelings than my youngest child. And so for him, it really has been figuring out how to teach him to reflect on them and make value aligned choices as opposed to just being driven by them. And that took longer than with my youngest. And it's obviously still in process. They're still kids. My kids are now 6, 9, and 12. So obviously they're still learning a lot of these things. And as you said, like, I would say most adults make mistakes on this too, even the very savvy ones. I'm a psychologist, and sometimes my own feelings get away from me, right? Because we're tired or we're grumpy or something happens that just kind of triggers us really quickly before we can catch it. But it is a skill. And so the kind of therapy that I practice, that I talk a lot about in the book, which is called Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, has a whole host of practices that help you to get clear on like what it is that you're feeling, and also in the context of whatever your circumstances are, what are your values? How do you want to show up? And again, I think that you can start having those kinds of conversations with kids very, very young. I mean, you can, in a sense, like plant the seed and then keep the conversation going. And it's one of these really useful skills, because then they can know themselves better. They can know what's working, what's not, and figure out for themselves like how they want to show up. And that is important for them to figure out. We can't dictate that. We can try, but it won't work.
So, I mean, I'm trying to think if there are, are there particularly famous children's books or such that sort of that introduce this idea? Like, I got into like sort of discussions of of free will with my son when we were watching the TV show Lost, which is, but I'm trying to think, is there like a Dr. Seuss book that's about or mental states or
yeah.
I mean, the thing is, we're always teaching empathy and so on, but but what you're pointing to is like there's like sort of a layer or mental model behind that
Yeah.
and I don't know that kids have a lot of sort of exposure to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think off the top of my head of children's books that really talk about this. I mean, so there's this great book about feelings that's called There's No Such Thing as a Dragon. That's all about how it uses the analogy of a dragon, and the parents say like, dragons don't exist, and the dragon, the more that the parents say they don't exist, the dragon grows bigger and bigger. So it's this idea that it is helpful to acknowledge feelings rather than to try to suppress them. And actually laboratory science backs that up. It's called the suppression effect. The more we try to tamp down on, it's this idea of like that which we resist persists and grows stronger. This is a quote from Carl Jung. So that's a great book. I really like this really adorable series called Dory Phantasmagory that talks about this little girl who has really big feelings and how she engages a fantasy life. I can think of others, but yeah, those are a couple that I love.
Yeah, if you guys, I don't know if if the bookstore carries this, or if I would put that into the chat, or
I was going to ask you, Rachel is often up on the kids' floor selling books, and I was going to wonder if there was a particularly good book about feelings that she knows about.
There we go.
Well, I just wanted to second the Dory Phantasmagory recommendation.
Isn't that so
a great
cute?
Series.
Yeah,
it is, and I just put a link to There's No Such Thing as a Dragon into the chat, which I had not known before, but my colleague Jeanette apparently really loves that book too. So
yeah, it's really great.
And we do have copies in the store. So we do have a couple of audience questions that have come in, and we're actually very close to out of time. So one that came in from Anna, she wanted to know, Yael, you have an academic background. Was it different writing for a popular audience this time?
Yeah, so different. So, I'm trained as an academic writer, and it was definitely a slow evolution for which Alex is largely responsible. So I randomly wrote this New York Times piece that got published in 2014. That was like my first foray into non-academic writing. And then I decided I wanted to write a book, and I, with Alex's help, actually got connected to an agent, and the agent actually also helped me. So it was definitely a process. The way that you talk to academic audiences is like night and day with how you talk to popular press audiences. Not to mention that, I mean, there's a real skill to translating scientific findings in a way that's interesting and accessible. And I do, like, now that I'm more in this world and in the popular press writing world, I read academic articles or books, and I'm like, ooh, it's really boring and dry. Nobody's going to want to keep reading. So it's sort of figuring out, like, how do you digest the science, the really good nuggets that will help people, but make it like fun to read about.
Yeah, I think there's a challenge in a way in sort of having done both of these. That it's about sort of popular writing is sort of, it's a lot more about making the reader smarter than it is about sort of demonstrating your own intelligence.
Yeah.
There are a whole bunch of just academic instincts that you've got to like learn. You just got to sort of toss overboard.
Yeah.
But sorry, other questions I should get out of the way.
That's a great question, though. I love that. Thank you.
I think we've got time for just one more question that comes in from Ezra, and he asks, Did you find it hard to apply your research to your own parenting?
I mean, it's hard, I guess, but I feel really fortunate. Like I'm not sure I'm the best parent in the world, but I think I'm a solid parent. I feel confident about my parenting. And it is, I would say, both because I'm a psychologist who thinks about these things. And I don't beat my kids over the head with psychology all the time, but it helps me to sort of orient in a more helpful way. The kind of therapy that I practice is also like the philosophy by which I live my life. And the science is really helpful. It kind of gives me permission to let go or to decide that it is worth investing in something. And so I think I don't struggle with guilt as much, which is so freeing. Like I don't have to carry that weight around as much as I see many, many other parents carrying it, especially mothers. And it helps me to like understand what's important and what's not. And then I have like a lot of tools, like when things, right, my kids are normal kids, like they struggle. And so when they're struggling, I have a set of a really well-resourced toolkit that I can draw from. And it doesn't always go perfectly. And that's okay too, because the research says, and the practices say, we can mess up. And that is really good opportunities for our kids to learn, because we're learning and growing too. So when I mess up, I own it. Like I tell my kids, like, mom screwed up. I'm so sorry. Like I need to do better. I'm still figuring it out. And they get to witness that and learn and grow along with me and see that like there's no shame in making mistakes. Like that's a part of learning and growing. So it's actually a wonderful opportunity for me to demonstrate that, to model it. And kids learn just as much from, maybe more from our modeling as they do from the lessons that we impart through our words. I love that question though. Thank you.
Well, Yael, Alex, thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful event. We really appreciate it. The book is Work, Parent, Thrive. You can order it at northshire.com. And the link in the chat. Alex, there's the cover of the book. It's got a beautiful green bind. It's lovely. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful, wonderful evening. And we'll see you at another Northshire Presents virtual event sometime soon.
Thank you so much for hosting us. This was really fun. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. Terrific time.
Thanks, guys. Take care. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
All right.